And we're back. So here we are in part 3. I'm going to finish our conversation about validity. So validity generalization is the degree to which evidence validly obtained in one situation can be generalized to another situation without further study. So the idea here is, boy, that position is similar enough, or this person's specification that I'm searching for in this position is virtually identical to this person's specification in another situation. So my validity assessment or argument might generalize from one position in the use of that measure to a second position, if I can make the case they're similar enough. For those of you who are real research nerds, and you've studied quasi-experimental methods, this similarity becomes one of the key issues. Were my two conditions similar to each other? And when you're doing quasi-experimental research, that's always kind of at the heart of answering objections, is answering those questions of similarity. In this case, it's answering questions about the similarity of two positions and how this measure being demonstrated valid for position A would also be valid for position B based on my argument of the similarity between A and B. Now, meta-analysis is one way to get at this, and when we use meta-analysis, what we're doing is looking at multiple studies that have been conducted around a measure. So it's got to be a relatively popular measure with a lot of literature around it, and then we look at all the findings surrounding this measure. We look at all the studies and we use special techniques to combine the results of multiple studies to meta-analyze or analyze the analyses, so to speak, and that's why it's called meta-analysis. No guarantee the same validity will be found in any specific workplace. That might make a difference. And legal acceptability of validity generalization is kind of shaky. So really validation might guide us, this idea of validity generalization. I'd like to use this measure because I believe position A is similar enough to position B, and we've been successful in our validity measurement previously with one position. Then we would go ahead and use that measure to screen applicants for a second position, but we're still really should do the validity analysis on the second position and not just leave it undone. So, reasons for different scores on a test or assessment then. Okay, so if we see differing scores, all these factors as well as others can influence the reliability. That is why test assessment tools should be standardized in their use. So people should be trained to use them in the same manner, present them in the same manner. Ideally the same tester would be used, but if you have different testers, they have to have identical training. Right? And their conformance to the training needs to be evaluated. We just don't bring people in a room, train them and say, okay, we're good to go. Then we need to observe the people to see that the training caused people to behave similarly, or if the training needs work, we might see differences in performance. Right? Now, temporary or physical state is important here, so we should really do applicants the honor of asking them, how you doing, anything going on, is there anything that's happened recently that might affect your performance on this measure. It's a good icebreaker, and it's just good human courtesy to look at people that way. Environmental factors, right? So in laboratory research we try to control this, right? We have a thermostat, we set it at a given temperature. We don't run half of our research at 68 degrees and the other half at 82 degrees room temperature, because then we come to the end and we look at the results and we say, well, is this because of the manipulation, or is this on the results we are observing on the basis of a temperature change, which is not what we were trying to, and notice that kind of contaminates the features. Okay. The version or form of the measure should be standardized and should be the same, and if it's subjective evaluation, then different evaluators might cause noise in the data, unreliability. Notice, this is why when we design interview questions, we use the same interview questions for each applicant, we use them in the same order, and we all use the same scoring rubric. So we try to eliminate the potential effect of different evaluators. Now, a couple other issues here, types of errors, random error. It's error that's not due to any consistent cause, and this is just something that we can't control for. It's just something that occurs, right? And so we just have to factor it in probably not too much of an issue. Standard deviation might capture this, right? Systematic error is error that occurs because of consistent and predictable factors. So these are things we can track down and compensate for. Deficiency errors, when you fail to measure important aspects of the attribute you'd like to measure, as we discussed earlier. And then contamination error, right, is when you're measuring things that have nothing to do with the construct of interest. So we have to be aware of the type of errors. Of course, random error is the one error that we can't control, and that's just random variability. And when we, like in org psych, when we were talking about random error, this is something that Dr. Deming would be fascinated with and would give us the statistical tools to understand that some errors we just can't control, and this is just built into the variability in the measure. Now, factor analysis really allows us to look at the idea of what does this measure anyway. And for those of you who've taken the Myers-Briggs, right? The Myers-Briggs is really measuring 4 different constructs, correct? Introversion, extroversion, and so on down the list. When you look at the Myers-Briggs test, though, it doesn't section the 4 different constructs and ask you questions. Okay, well, now we're going to look for this, now we're going to look for this, whether you're thinking or feeling, right? Or whether you're sensing or intuitive, right? It doesn't present them in 4 different bodies. It's got like 40, 50 questions that are all mixed. And the idea is, with factor analysis, is, hey, we have a measure, we have the Myers-Briggs. What does it measure? Does it measure different constructs? And in the case of Myers-Briggs, it measures 4 different constructs. In the case of the NEO, that is the big 5, it measures 5 different constructs, right? So factor analysis is usually used by people who are developing measures to determine whether the measure measures one construct or whether it measures multiple constructs. Right? So it's kind of a high-level statistical technique. I had a graduate school class in factor analysis that was taught by Dr. Brown, who's one of the creators of factor analysis. It's pretty cool, and it's difficult, but it allows us to do certain things. For example, one of the measures that we were interested in using when we wanted to determine how people looked at punishment preferences was right-wing authoritarianism. But what we're looking for is what causes a person to want to punish someone more. Do all 34 questions in the right-wing authoritarianism scale point to punishment preferences? And we did factor analysis because we had a large sample, and we found that 9 of the 34 questions really kind of predicted how people wanted to punish. And we renamed those 9 questions as a subscale, authoritarian control. But how did we get there? We did it through the process of factor analysis. So factor analysis is kind of the higher level idea of determining the extent to which items are intercorrelated and conceptual domains being assessed, right? It's used to assign items to underlying traits. That is, a measure might in fact measure more than one thing. This allows us to understand the contamination factor to a greater extent. Wow, I got this 30 item measure. This is the construct I want to measure. What questions actually measure that construct and what questions kind of are going down a different path. Right? So it's used to understand the validity of any given measure. We found it a useful tool because we could take existing measures and we could pull out some sub-component of that measure and use just that with better predictive validity. Right? So, and it's done in 2 forms, and if you're worried, I'm not going to make you do factor analysis, but the reason I'm mentioning it, one of the questions in your Find a Measure assignment is, has this measure undergone factor analysis? So I want you to at least understand what that means and how to look at it. So exploratory factor analysis is what we do right off the bat. Like, we took the right-wing authoritarian measure. We had 700 participants and we did exploratory factor analysis. And we identified 3 factors in the measure. The one we were interested in, we named authoritarian control. So in exploratory factor analysis, what we did is we looked at that measure and we said, hey, we tested it to see if there was 2 factors. We tested it to see if there was 3 factors. We tested it to see if there was 4 factors. 3 factors seemed to be the sweet spot where we got the most reliable solution. Right? Are there items that fail to load on any factors? That is, someone might develop a measure and find that 4 or 5 items out of 50 are kind of senseless or useless. They don't correlate to anything else in the measure. Or do some items then load on multiple factors? So really, I know. Just so you get a flavor for it. Now, here's the deal, and this is key to hypothesis testing. We explore first, right? And we say, oh, look at that. It appears that there's 3 factors in right-wing authoritarianism. Okay? What do you want to do with that? Well, now we flip it around and we predict that in a new sample we will find through factor analysis 3 factors. So in the first time it was exploratory, we just went in and tested 2, 3, 4 factors. Once you determine that it's likely 3, then you make, I hypothesize that there's 3 factors. You take a new sample and see if it confirms your hypothesis. So that would be the confirmatory factor analysis, right? So once the existence of underlying factors has been established in a sample, the factor analysis is conducted with a new sample to verify what you just did. It's essentially a form of replication, right? So, factor analysis process, really what you're doing, if there's 50 questions, you're looking at the correlation of question 1 to question 2, question 1 to question 3, question 1 to question 4, on through 50, and then you go the correlation of question 2 to question 3. Yeah, each pair of items are assessed for that correlation. Then there's some computer generated magic if you use a computer program. Back in the day when Dr. Brown was doing it, they actually did this by hand, and it was humorous, the stories he would tell, because he said, you know, a large scale factor analysis could take us up to 6 months with 3 people working on it because they had to do the math by hand. Once the computers came along and he actually wrote a computer program to do this, you could put your correlation matrix in and spit out the answer in about 3 seconds. It's fascinating what computers can do for us. But it confirms the existence of discovered hypothesized factors using confirmatory factor analysis. This is not likely something you will do in a personnel selection job. But if you go into psychometrics, you begin to develop your own measures, then factor analysis is something you're going to have to pull out of your toolkit and you're going to have to use on what you've created or what you're trying to manipulate in terms of another measure. So, bottom line on factor analysis, it's a technique for grouping items that are rather homogeneous and independent clusters. It facilitates the investigation and validation against empirically developed criteria. So for defensibility, it might be a handy tool in court. Permits accurate combination of items if you so wish, if you want to eliminate items or combine them. And it also helps us understand, what is this measure measuring? Altmaier developed right-wing authoritarianism. What does that mean? And is it a single idea, or does it actually have multiple components in it? All right, some example measures. Let's take the MMPI. Picked on it quite a bit. The MMPI is most commonly used by mental health professionals to assess diagnosed mental illness. It's been utilized in other fields outside clinical psychology, legal cases, criminal defense, custody disputes. It's a screening instrument for certain professions like police work. And the use of the MMPI in those arenas is relatively controversial, and the problem is, do MMPI scores validly predict some criteria of job performance? And it becomes an issue of validity then, right? It's also used to evaluate the effectiveness of treatment programs, including substance abuse programs. That is, so MMPI pre-treatment and then MMPI post-treatment to see how it operated. Now, MMPI identifies possible problem areas like difficulties with alcohol or substance use, also manipulation or exploitation of others, various thought disorders like paranoid thinking, over-controlled hostility, repressed hostility, family conflict or alienation from family, depressive affect or mood disorders, hypomanic episodes, for example. awkward or difficult interpersonal relationships, extensive use of sick call, malingering is another term for that, or maybe an anger control. And there's a live link to the MMPI website if you want to check it out there. So notice this is a big test. It's about 500 questions. It takes a couple hours to complete. And notice though all the different areas it taps into. So the behavioral dimensions then, apparent need for further mental health assessment or programming. So often it's a screening tool used by clinicians. Apparent leadership ability, dominance is another thing it might speak to. Indications of conflict, so the resentment of authority. And we can go on down the list. Apparent need for social participation, extroversion, right? Or likelihood of hostile, antagonistic. So if we look then at the different differentiating items, how well does it do differentiating a classificatory test? I'm being plotted against. Well, how does it do? How do people then answer this question? Because on the MMPI, this would be a question I'm being plotted against, right? So we take a look at this single question, and we say, okay, in our sample of paranoids, 67% of the paranoids will say, yes, I'm being plotted against. Whereas people who are considered or have a different diagnosis, that is, of being normal, only 12 people will respond in the affirmative to this question. I shop at Woolworths. Well, notice, paranoids, 40. Normals, 37. Notice, this question then we can look at doesn't distinguish paranoia from normals. Nor should it, nor do we expect it to. I have many vague symptoms. Well, for paranoids and normals, the score is equal. But let's not talk about paranoids versus normals. Let's talk about hypochondriacs versus normal. I have many vague symptoms. Well, hypochondriacs, they're all going to say, yes, of course I agree. It's going to be like, 70, 80%. Normals, 11%. So we can see that that question does a good job of differentiating hypochondriacs from normals, but it would do a poor job of differentiating paranoids from normals. And again, what are we about? Ultimately, we're about distinguishing someone who will be good at a job versus someone who won't be good at a job, or will be a good fit and won't be a good fit. So this gets back to the validity, right? People often stare at me. Well, paranoids, yeah, 59% are saying, yeah. Normals, 2%. So these questions, you can see, there's two questions that do a fantastic job of differentiating paranoids from normals, whereas there are two questions that don't do well at all. Domain, facets of the NEO, Big Five, neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, conscientiousness. To what extent does this predict job performance? Not very well. Conscientiousness is probably one of the better predictors, right? But you can see, how would neuroticism differentiate on the job performance necessarily? How would extroversion differentiate? Can you make a case for it? Can you demonstrate it over time through some validity assessment? Let's pick on the Myers-Briggs, right? And this is where it gets really crazy, because, I mean, to what extent do these predict on-the-job performance? Not very well at all. Why people are still using the Myers-Briggs, other than for just the joy of reflecting on oneself, which we all like to do, at least most of us, right? But other than that, predicting, the validity of predicting on-the-job performance is a serious question. Now, let's look at the occupational personality questionnaire. And this will assess relationships with people, ideas and cognitive style, feelings like anxiety, energy, self-concept. And again, there's a link here so you can look at further. So these are just examples of different kind of mostly trait-based measures that might be questionable in their employ. I already mentioned need for cognition when I was talking about the research I did with Derek. This measures the extent that one needs to or likes to think. And this might be relatively predictive of good performance in certain jobs that require someone who is eager to think, engaged in thinking, and willing to think, right? Those who thought to be neat cog demonstrate more positive attitudes towards intellectual challenges and opportunities to problem solve. So you might be able to make a case for it when you're looking at someone who, let's say, is writing complex code and they're asked to design a program. to the extent they need to think, they might persist for a greater amount of time. They might investigate more options in how to write the code. They might be more thorough in how the code performs. And notice I'm using might, could be. These are things we can validate, because if we use a need for cognition and we hire people on the basis of this as a partial criteria, and then we validate it down the road on some basis of performance that seems like it should be related. So, tips for candidate assessment. Measures should be used in a purposeful manner. Use a variety of tools, not just one, but multiple tools. Use measures that are unbiased and fair to all groups. No adverse impact, please. Use measures that are reliable first and then valid second. And when you're doing your find a measure assignment, try to report on that if that information has been collected on the measures. And if the information hasn't been collected on those measures, then I would be suspicious of using those measures, because why hasn't it been validated? Try and find personalysis anywhere. You can't find information on it that is empirical in any type of nature. So use measures that are appropriate for the target population. Ensure that staff are properly trained, and again this goes back to reliability. Ensure suitable and uniform assessment conditions. Eliminate that source of variability. Maintain instrument security and security of the results. You don't want the measure getting out beforehand so people can practice it or figure out how to answer it in a desirable way. And then the results need to be kept confidential as well. Maintain the confidentiality, interpret scores properly, and that is learn how to do that. Okay. Darn it. I'm going to have to make this a part 4 here, I guess.